All right, I'm just going to do a quick check with the AV team. Are we good to start over there? Fantastic. So I know folks are coming in from other sessions as well. So we have people that are here in the room and we have people that are watching online. So hello to everybody that is watching online as well. This session will probably go on for about 40 to 45 minutes. And I know that there are other things that people are probably doing online that they want to go to at the conference as well. So we'll keep it to the point and we'll discuss a very, very specific topic. Now, I know we've called it Put the First Things First, as you can see, how to lead your not-for-profit through security leadership and how to lead your not-for-profit through cybersecurity initiatives. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by actually defining this term, and then we'll go on a bit of a journey around some steps that you can take. With that said, my name is Ali. I'm sorry you saw me in the last session as well. You're going to have to bear with me for this one too. And I'm going to jump right into the conversation, first by asking my panelists to introduce themselves. I've always said this before, you manage things and you lead people. And in this session, we're going to look at people, process, and technology, and how with your not-for-profit, you can actually lead them through a cybersecurity journey. Before I do that, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. Brent, let's start off with you. Welcome to your first ever Canadian Women in Cybersecurity experience.
Thank you.
Tell the audience a little bit about what you do, and just for introduction's sake, why is this conference important to you?
That's a very good question. I think, first off, I think seeing more women in the profession is a very important thing, and it's great to see the level of women and the participation in the event today. Yep. Second off, my name is Brent Thomas. I'm currently the CISO and Director of Technology and Modernization at a company called Traffic Tech. We do third-party logistics globally, and I'm also an advisor to Humint, which we're both a part of.
Absolutely, and I'll be referencing Humint as we go along. A shout out to them for sponsoring this session. And now from a very, very exotic land called Lindsay, Ontario, we have Graeme Barrie. Graeme, you've been at every Canadian Women in Cybersecurity conference, this time around with a different beard, but always something mighty. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself and what brought you back to this conference.
Yeah, every year it's different facial hair, but it's always gray or white. Shows how long I've been in the industry. I'm only 25. Every year it really shows how the industry is changing, improving. More women in the industry. Which is good to see. I've been in IT for 27 years, and I remember going to conferences and there would be 500 guys and 2 women. So it's heartening to see how things are changing. It's good to see.
Sure.
Yeah, and seeing all the young faces as well is good to see. Lots of new talent coming into the industry. So I'm here to impart some of my hopeful wisdom and ready for the talk.
All right, and with that, Maryam, I'm sorry you have to deal with the three of us, but we'll try to keep the conversation focused on topic. We can easily go into different directions. Welcome, I believe last year as well, you were at Canadian Women in Cyber.
Yes.
Can you tell the audience a little bit about what you do and what brings you back to this conference?
Sure. So great to be here again for the second year. And I lead the cyber threat intelligence practice for Accenture Canada. I come from a background in detection and response, essentially anything in security operations, but for the good part of the past decade focused on cyber threat intelligence. Exciting area to be in, obviously. And what brings me back, probably as a woman in cyber, and probably the older generation of women in cyber with almost 20 years in the industry, it's good to be here and good to see the fresh blood, the next generation who's taken over from us, and also good to see folks from a lot of different industries and backgrounds as well.
Graeme, are you happy when she said fresh blood? She looked at you as well. So she believed you that you're 25. Fair enough. All right. So before we dive into this topic, my colleague here, who's also more of a mentor to me, although I haven't known him for a very long time, he advised me that it's important for us to establish what do we mean by not-for-profit, right? And what do we mean by this sector? So I will provide a very quick definition and then we'll go into our discussion. Really, when you talk about the not-for-profit and non-profit, now there is a legally different meaning between non-profit and not-for-profit. And to the best of my limited knowledge, so my 2 rupees of thought on it, it has to do with how you use your investments from a revenue perspective. There are different classifications of how you do it with not-for-profits and non-profits. But for our discussion, what we're looking at is charitable organizations. We're looking at, to a degree, hospitals that might be community-run hospitals. And we're looking at social initiatives within your communities that have a pretty large footprint, offer some critical services like housing, other mental health supports, etc. And we're looking at that as a starting point for this discussion on how to assist those leaders with starting them down a cybersecurity journey. Now, why specifically speak about the not-for-profit sector? In our research for this session, there was a particular not-for-profit digital alliance that did a pretty extensive research of about 170 charities, mentioning less than 20% of them had security or any map around security listed as one of their priorities. And the fundamental problem is obviously resourcing, but they're not sure where to start, prioritization. So Maryam, I'm going to start off with you. We've given you a bit of a sense of the field and what you're dealing with over here. Imagine you're a leader of one of these not-for-profit organizations. How do you prioritize? What would be your top 3 priorities given who you service and given your mandates that you have and even the sources of your funding?
Yes, so I would say in terms of probably just looking at it even with my threat intelligence sort of hat on in terms of what we see, it's really important to understand the risk, the specific risk based on the mission of the organization and the domain in which they operate and the data that they hold. Because when we say, based on the definition Lee provided, that can really run the gamut. There could be organizations that deal with areas that sometimes may have adversaries that if it's a topic that is a bit more sensitive or it might be contentious, whether it's social, political, economical, etc., well, you might be dealing with a different set of adversaries, be it hacktivists or otherwise, that may be looking for information on donors or opportunistic in terms of financial information. So I think it's critical to understand that contextualized to the mission, understanding of the risk. What data does the organization hold? What responsibilities and obligations they have from a legal perspective or otherwise? So that would be the first priority from where then you decide, all right, what do I need to focus on? What would be the priorities and what are the top risks that I'm trying to protect the organization as well as the donors and the public from. So I think it's just understanding first the landscape as it applies to the specific organization.
All right, Brent, I'm going to come to you, and I think Graeme knows this all too well. The plan for my session is that there is no plan. So I'm just going to work with what you're saying, and I'm going to start to build questions from there. Okay. I mean, that's why we're here, right? So Brent, a question for you is that when it comes to what Maryam just said, you need to understand what some of your obligations are and what some of your risks look like. From your perspective, even having that conversation can be quite a challenge because you have to tap into what finance might know, what HR might know. What does that look like, and how do you begin that conversation around we need to prioritize certain areas?
Absolutely. So to the point Mary made, understanding the profile of the organization, understanding its risks will determine the level of posture that you need to have in place. Okay. And to the question about who to work with and how to have those conversations, I mean, depending on the organization you work for, I think understanding what their business objectives are, what the strategies are, what the goals of the organization are is a good first step, because then you can have an informed discussion with the HR departments, the finance departments, the legal teams, the privacy teams, right? And then the overall, leadership for the organization. First have that conversation to understand their point of view, understand, what's important to them, where they want you to focus, and then also understand, where they can help you, right? Because as you start out with these organizations, there's a lot to learn, there's a lot to take in, and you obviously want to figure out where you're going to get help, where you're not, right? And what's important to one person versus another, so you can prioritize what you're going to do effectively.
Now, in terms of what you have to get done, Graeme, this is something as an independent consultant in the world of security, you deal with this quite a bit, is how much of this work is manual and how much can be automated? And for someone who hasn't, there are a lot of leaders right now, and primarily there are a lot of folks who lead not-for-profits right now that have come into realizing we need to do something about security because they saw their insurance bill go up. How do you have that discussion about explaining what can be automated and what is manual?
Yeah, that's a good one. Really, I start having the conversation building on what Maryam said about identifying, what are your crown jewels, what are your assets, and start building out from there, and then layering in what automation we can put in. Automation's a tough one because, and a lot of times it requires budget, which you're clawing for. You're competing against the other divisions in the organization in some cases. So the idea of automation, you try to automate your patching, et cetera, and start minimizing those risks. It really is a hard conversation to have about, how do you automate when there's not a lot of budget? It is really a manual effort initially until you start getting some dollars your way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that you'll face, and we're going to come into this question, is the aspect around who's responsible for what in this scenario. Now, Brent, I want to come to you because in a lot of not-for-profits that we've looked at, CDCD, we have folks from the Salvation Army as well here. Security then, once it's been identified as, all right, from a leadership perspective, it's hit budgets from an insurance standpoint. We've had events that have happened. Now it's a responsibility thing and you have to look at your team. And typically, security in many of these organizations sits under IT ops. From your perspective, is that workable? And is that something that it's there, but is it desirable?
Well, I think traditionally for many IT security teams, they started under IT, right? As you get into bigger organizations, as security becomes more of an important thing, right? You see it, under different areas of the organization. But again, coming back for the not-for-profit, if it's a smaller organization, you're going to put people where you think they best fit, right? And it doesn't mean that they won't work across the organization, right? They often do. So you got to figure out, again, right, where do they fit based on the size of the organization and what they're doing day to day. I mean, a lot of the cybersecurity functions are very technically focused, so it makes sense for them to be kind of under IT, but you may have an organization where that security resource also has a dotted line into privacy, right? Or into finance or into legal, right? So they've still got that relationship, and they can still use any one of their leadership structures to move forward the priorities they're trying to push.
Maryam, if I can take that question and translate it in a different way to you as well, how do you repurpose your team to a degree where different departments now have to start looking at security as one of their priorities as well? And keeping in mind that within a lot of not-for-profits, the HR culture is a little bit different. There are unionized environments as well. How do you now suddenly add another line item like security there? And how do you do that in a way where it's digestible?
Yeah, I think it's actually interesting you asked that question because I think increasingly, regardless of the size of the organization or what sector you're in, increasingly cybersecurity is becoming a part of everybody's job. Because we have to. It's just the ways in which the attackers are targeting organizations is becoming so diffuse. So unless we sort of diffuse that layer of security across the board, there'll always be that issue with the weakest link, right? And luckily, there's more awareness nowadays. Sometimes something picks up in terms of conversations about cybersecurity in pop culture, whether nowadays is generative AI or whatever it is, but at least people are talking about it and becoming more aware. So I think that issue of making security a part of everybody's job, that has to be there. because it makes it more digestible, especially in environments that are more resource constrained. But additionally, as the organization builds the ecosystem of what contributes to cybersecurity, there are going to be elements that are built into, say, cloud services that they have outsourced, or they may be bringing in specialists on demand to support certain functions. Or even if we think about either technology vendors, or even if I can speak for some of the consulting firms that I have worked with, there's this big focus on contributing for social impact. So take every opportunity to bring in the experts as needed, but also build in cybersecurity into every function, both from a technical perspective as well as a human perspective.
I want to work with that just a little bit more, because again, you've emphasized on that element that I was talking about in the last session, which is people, process, technology, and in that order. From a people perspective, Graeme, not only now are you in this situation where you have to start putting in security into different departments, so on and so forth, but now it's also a matter of creating some metrics that you require. And here's where we're at, and here's where we need to be at. Can you shed a little bit of perspective on how you've helped organizations gradually mature through that process, and what does that timeline look like, especially in this sector?
Yeah, I think I would begin with having the chat with the board and seeing what they would like to see. If are they wanting to see more of an ROI on their spend with security, or are they wanting to see more of, this is our landscape, this is the number of attacks we're seeing monthly, annually, whatever, and then show us a decrease that way. So I would let them lead the discussion and see what they actually want to see, but then kind of push them along a little bit to show, okay, this was our baseline. We had X number of employees failing phishing tests. Systems are continually out of date, what have you. So we could do a blend of some technical plus people-based KPIs, and then show how we're improving over time. And you mentioned insurance earlier. We can use that as a KPI as well to say, okay, 2 years ago we weren't insurable. Now we are, and now we're starting to see a trend of, partner organizations, their costs are going up, but ours are leveling because we are putting in security measures.
Absolutely. Now, as you said before, a leader knows the way, shows the way, and goes the way. But Brent, in this situation, many of the executive leaders in the not-for-profit space, this is their first foray into security.
Absolutely.
And with the budget constraints that you see out there, and with some of the challenges that they have from a resources perspective, for a leader themselves, what is, in your opinion, a good starting point to start to develop their own knowledge of this space?
So I think, when starting a program in any organization, you want to start to build a good awareness program. You want your users, all the resources for the organization, to understand their role as it relates to cybersecurity, to Maryam's point, because it's everyone's business. And if you start to build that awareness, they'll naturally start to understand the challenges that are in front of them and understand the landscape they're working with. Certainly pulling materials, references from the news, from other media that shows similar organizations in other geographies, what their challenges are, so they can start to understand things in that context. It's a bit of a walk at first, right? Because you want to make sure they're following along and understanding where you're trying to go. If you go too fast and speaking a lot of technical jargon, you're going to lose them, right? But how do you keep them with you, following along the story, to build that sense of urgency and understanding of what needs to be done?
Another thing that I'll add to this is this element of sandboxing and testing. And so as I mentioned before, being the lead for security for YES, but also teaching at different institutions, I believe I even see Belinda from OCI, Ontario Centers of Innovation. One thing that I do recommend for not-for-profits is to consider some of the partnerships that you can establish with your local colleges and universities. There's funding that can be applied to that. I don't want to speak for the funding bodies that are there. I think you can speak to folks at OCI, for example. I don't necessarily know if this funding can be directly applied to a not-for-profit or a charity, But what I do know is that you can get into different partnerships with a private sector organization. For example, there are a couple of firms that are out here today, I think Opus Security being one of them, Netmechanics is also in that boat as well, where essentially what they have is partnerships with funding providers where they can provide you a service where I believe about 75 to 80% of it can get subsidized. And I don't know the details, but I highly recommend having those conversations because these are good test beds that you can get into. Secondly, as a starting point, some of the vendors also have starter packs that you can begin with. Myself and Graeme, for example, do a lot of work with Canary, which is the federal R&E network that has something called a booster pack, which can actually be applied to some of the things that you're looking to do. There's some innovation ethos, etc. behind it, but these are good areas to start looking into when you're looking not just for resources and what to prioritize, but also for some ways to minimize the blow to your budget from the get-go. Now, with that in mind, Maryam, I want to bring it back to you because one of the important elements about not-for-profits and charities in our organizations, in our communities, is how embedded they are within the communities. What do leaders, and I know this wasn't in our script, we're definitely going to go away from it. I already forewarned you, so forewarned is forearmed. What are some of their responsibilities to their end users?
Oh gosh, it goes back to that question, the comment I made earlier about making sure that the leaders are looking at what the risk looks like, both for donors and users, but very much within the context of their mission, because some of the consequences can be dire. For example, if you consider nonprofit organizations working with vulnerable populations, well, what if their data gets compromised or released, et cetera, right? Or again, if you have, as I mentioned, you have sometimes certain topics or areas that may get contentious at a point in time. So again, if there's personal information that is released, what does that mean in terms of the individuals who are supporting certain causes, if you will, right? So I think it's really in terms of what the leaders need to think about in terms of what they owe to their end users, again, goes back to carefully look at the risk as it applies to your mission. And what that means in terms of also the threat actors, the attackers that are going to come after you, because depending, again, on your mission, there could be great asymmetry in their capabilities.
Yeah.
So you're still the same target that is vulnerable, but now there is someone highly capable and sophisticated, not just opportunistic, coming after you. So I think it's really critical to look through that lens, and then always make sure, to the extent possible, my approach would be try to minimize, if we don't need to collect the data, to the extent possible, minimize, but then protect. So that's how I would at least get the leaders to think about it.
You mentioned the word protect, right? And you are in threat intelligence, so
Yes.
I've taken a leaf from your book, and I'm going to listen twice as much as I speak, because there's something that you mentioned there, which is, again, the protect and threat intelligence.
Yes.
And Graeme, I want to come to you, because one of the things that you've done is try to find ways where, in a cost-effective way, you can run these protection exercises. You can be proactive. Tabletops, for example. How essential are those? And yes, they can be very pricey. Now, I, for example, am a game host with Cyber, and that's a gamified experience. I'll be running one at 2 o'clock as well, shameless plug. In case you didn't have enough of seeing me, you'll see me there rolling some dice, maybe giving out some prize money, maybe rupees, I don't know, we'll figure that out when we get there. But that said, when I speak to a lot, for example, I'm on a couple of boards, and you go to the executive and you show them the cost of a tabletop exercise, it can be quite cost prohibitive. What are some steps that you would recommend that you can run some simple ones just to get started?
Yeah, I think I like to approach them early on in an engagement, and not be like a full-blown exercise, but just start having a somewhat fun conversation of, okay, you're the CEO, you're HR, you're finance, all your data's inaccessible. How are you going to handle it? And that spurs the conversation, but it also, they almost become like deer in headlights. Yeah. They panic and realize, whoa, we're nowhere where we need to be. And then, as I said earlier, these things tend to open up budget. especially when you have them early on. And then you can start planning to, get that line item to say, maybe next year we do a full-blown exercise and get the board involved and things like that. It is a gradual process.
Yep.
You're not going to accomplish it all in 1 year.
Yep.
But even just that mock, ad hoc disaster gets the creative juices flowing, or some panic.
Yeah, absolutely. So a shameless plug and a teaser. And I see Mayuran from the CWC advisory is also here. He's probably played one of those games, tabletop exercise with me. But the one that I'll be running at 2 o'clock basically simulates an airline which suddenly all of their booking systems have gone down. And while there's a lot of technical reviews that have to happen, are there backups? And as you quickly realize, someone was sleeping at the wheel, probably someone like myself, the backups weren't happening, and the backups were corrupt. But then other things start to emerge. Like what Graeme just said, the communications piece starts to come up. Because you've lost all data of, for example, passengers that are on a flight. Sure, for people that are grounded, you can say, hey, don't board the flight, we have a problem. But what do you do about flights that are on air, that are right now in transit? And that presents a security situation. And the last time that I ran it, communications got involved. And then the inevitable question came up was, is this a terrorist attack? And these are questions that you start to ask yourself in the moment of running some of those tabletops. So I do highly recommend that you experience it, reach out, happy to talk further about what that looks like. And I'm sure Accenture runs some of them as well, so please reach out to them to learn more. That said, I had a question quickly come in, and a shout out to the AV team or whoever is doing it, sending me some of the questions. I caught the AV person off guard there. He's having a nice stretch, like, yeah, this is going to go on for another 30 minutes. I'm going to get myself a coffee. You can do it. You're doing a great job. I had a question come in, and Brent, I know that you can relate strongly to this. Suddenly now, a lot of leaders in this space are thinking, do I need to bring everything in-house? Mm-hmm. And the third-party vendor management piece, I'll give you an example. In one case, there's a charity that, since you brought it up, that was receiving funds, donors. And when asked, are you PCI DSS compliant? Oh yeah, the third party is PCI DSS compliant. If something happens, it's on them. And now they suddenly realize it's not entirely on them. So how do you talk to leaders in this space about how to manage third-party vendors?
Well, first point I want to make is you can't outsource accountability. Accountability
Put that on a
stays
t-shirt.
in-house, right? It doesn't go away. You can outsource responsibility, right? The day-to-day, the doing it, right? And operating things. But then it's your role inside the organization to make the decisions, right? To move forward on recommendations as appropriate. Yeah. There's never a perfect balance of what you do in-house or insource versus outsource. Okay. It seems to be almost cyclical, right? You see organizations outsource like their SOC, and then they're not happy with it, so they bring it back in, right? Yeah. Or you outsource vulnerability management or policy development, right? And you see how it goes. I think really comes down to getting a set of partners you can work with that are cost effective, that understand the needs of your organization, and can provide you what you need as you need it, and figure out what works with the org the best, right? You may have outsourced IT providers providing other IT services. Maybe there's an opportunity to say, hey, can you also run patch management for me, right? You may have an organization that works with your privacy department, right? On doing PIAs. Maybe they can also do some of the cybersecurity policy work, right? So figure out where to kind of fit it in, so you're still getting the cost efficiencies that not-for-profits after, and also getting further along in your cybersecurity journey, right? It's a lot of creativity, if you will, right? And you're figuring out what goes where, right? And there's no perfect answer.
Makes sense. Graeme, I'm going to bring this back to you now. Extending from what we just heard from Brent, you and I have had this conversation many times. Everybody knows the price of everything but the value of nothing. And as philosophically rich as that sounds, it's true that you kind of just look at the bottom line. Now, one of the things that we started to see in this sector is the evolution of the role of vCISOs and shared CISOs. Can you help our audience understand how does that vCISO or shared CISO model work? And can it be beneficial, and to what point?
Yeah, for sure. Hiring a CISO is cost preventative for a lot of organizations. The annual salaries are going up and up. So a vCISO, it's a fractional CISO. So you're getting someone for 10 hours a month, 20 hours a month, whatever budget will allow. And it gives you that security guidance, not only from a technical perspective, but also from a business perspective. They bring in a wide breadth of knowledge. They're keeping abreast of vulnerability management, all the marketplace, the industry, et cetera. So they're bringing that to you at a lower cost. To add on what was just mentioned about external partners, a vCISO can be there as a sounding board. And shameless plug, I'm a vCISO. So when I go into organizations that do have MSPs, we have the conversation. Where's your incident response plan? Where's your disaster recovery plan? Well, our MSP handles it. Well, they're doing your backups, but what does that mean about your business continuity and your disaster recovery? Yeah, they say they're going to restore your data, but what does that mean, and how quickly can they restore it? Which department's going to get restored first? Is it going to be finance? So these conversations, you start to see them go, oh, geez, we never even considered that. So we start to have those conversations, and the vCISO then becomes kind of a conduit between the organization and the third parties from a security perspective, and in some cases a business continuity perspective to, answer vendors' security questionnaires, insurance questionnaires, all that stuff. So it's becoming more and more, I don't want to say critical or essential, it's really helping smaller organizations get a foothold in establishing their security programs.
Well said. It's, again, putting the first things first. It's a starting point. Maryam, I want to come to you again and come back to the subject of threat intelligence. And I want to demystify it a bit, because when you look at threat intelligence from a strictly technical perspective, sure, you're looking at from signatures to anomaly, you're looking at taxi feeds, sticks feeds, whatever have you. But there's an element of sharing intelligence between not-for-profits that can be very strong. For example, oh yeah, we also got a similar email to that, or we also got a similar request to that. How can you get started on sharing, even if it's baseline, some baseline intelligence about what you're experiencing in your particular organization?
Yeah, and I think in terms of some of the investments that are being made, whether it's in Canada or some of the other governments, our neighbors to the south, I think from a starting point perspective, if we just take the tactical intelligence you mentioned, there is now more and more resources that are available. If you consider Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, or you consider the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange, intel sharing community, there are options that are, the cost is not high. If it's CCCS, that's free. Because there's a lot of emphasis, and I'm going to borrow a philosophical page from Ali's book, but it's increasingly, the cyber ecosystem is becoming connected. We're all connected one way or another, whether it's, for example, the third-party suppliers or vendors we talked about, but we increasingly hear about supply chain issues, as in that software that you had that you thought was just a reputable software, everything else, it somehow got infiltrated, etc. So I would say use the communities that are available first to get that tactical intelligence. Lots of resources available. That allows you to then connect with peers, connect with perhaps organizations that are far more mature and can share insights and intelligence from that perspective. And I think gradually that allows you to expand beyond that tactical.
Correct,
because we know threat intelligence nowadays, we do everything from looking underground at what people are saying to looking at what's happening on from a tactical perspective, but also in terms of how vendors and third parties are getting compromised. So that's probably the easiest starting point.
Yeah, and I think as a starting point, Brent, this idea of sharing with each other and creating some community around what you're going through, and again with security, it does come down a great deal to the community that's behind you and how much you can rely and you can share infrastructure as well. Brent, from your perspective, this idea of sharing infrastructure as well, creating a shared model for even services that you can consume, Is that something that's desirable? For example, sharing in your subscription, for example, to a CISO. For example, at Orion, which I was at before, one of the things that we ran with what we call the G8, we took 5 universities and 3 colleges, and we created a shared CISO. Farouk Nair, who might be here today, was a pioneer of that, and I worked hand in hand with him. The idea was, quite literally, that these universities that were involved had the budgets, but not necessarily the person power to manage a CISO, dedicated CISO. And a couple of these colleges also were in that situation as well. So they decided to subscribe to a shared CISO. Now that was a very interesting model, and then that resulted in shared infrastructure as well. How much you can consume in terms of pen testing, how much you can consume in terms of breach coaching, so on and so forth. And it was almost like a bit of a vending machine around consuming certain security services. Your thoughts on, are models like this desirable and scalable, or eventually do you have to become your own independent island and country like this man is in Lindsay, Ontario?
Well,
everybody clap. Look at that. Everybody clap for your spot in Lindsay, the only person doing security there. Brent, I digress. Go ahead.
it's a very interesting question, and I've taken the time to think about it in my answer. I think if you've got an example, let's say a hospital network, right? You've got multiple hospitals that are part of that network. Could they share a CISO? Probably, right? Would it work? Likely. You may have 2 entirely different organizations, right, with different mandates, or perhaps organizations that, in a way, compete against each other. Are you going to share the CISO? Probably not. So you're going to have to figure out those boundary lines. Is it achievable? Yes. Is it practical? I think it can be. Definitely more cost efficient. Definitely that knowledge of those organizations will help them, right? And perhaps there's opportunities to establish conduits of communication between the two, right? So there's better collaboration. And maybe they'll find other ways to share resources, right? Like I think about, the FSI SACs or the RHI SACs, right? Where there's a lot of that knowledge sharing and collaboration. We're just, I guess, with sharing resources, you're taking it to the next level, right? It's not just information, but it's time, it's effort, right? It's understandings.
Yep, and that makes sense. And again, for those of you that want to see and understand the shared model, it does undeniably bring back cost savings. If you look at it from a dollars and a cents perspective, it does, however, bring in other resources from the organization. So in my case, for example, at the Youth Employment Services, running security training and all of those things, sure, we've kind of shared a couple of the services that we use, but now it does bring in other folks where you do need, for example, more time from finance. You need contracts that have to come in from HR that are structured a little bit differently than a traditional employee would be within your organization. So it does open things up and the aperture quite a bit. With that said, a common question that we get across industry, and Graeme, I'll bring this to you, is a lot of folks in this sector, for a period of time, going back to why we decided to define not-for-profit at the beginning, a lot of groups tend to make that cardinal mistake, which is we're too small of a target to be hit. And from your perspective, especially, you had interesting insight post-pandemic, pre-pandemic, and during the pandemic. Why is this sector now really, really lucrative for attacks?
I think it's shone a light that there's a real weakness. The 2 of the most hit industries are healthcare and education, and they're generally the hardest hit when it comes to budgets and security spending. I mentioned when we were sitting here before we came on, I met with a small nonprofit last week, and they said, we're thinking we should maybe do something about security. And we started having the conversation, and she said, we've got 5 people in a board. We're not that big. I'm like, okay. And she said, but we manage $60 million. So, you're a target.
Not that big for our CISO friend over here, 60 million, but it is a big one when you've got 5 people there.
So, you have these small organizations that, like you said, depending on what they're managing, it could be personal information of a vulnerable population, or it could be a large portfolio of funding, loans, etc., or they could be a springboard into the community of
Right.
businesses and other healthcare or social service providers. So I think the bad guys are realizing that.
Yeah.
I want to add to that
Please,
for a
yeah.
second. So I do volunteer for a not-for-profit in the city of Toronto with a foundation of $20 million, right? And again, a very small team, right, that does all the day-to-day. Am I concerned about potential attacks against that small team? Absolutely.
Yep.
Most prevalent, phishing, right?
Yeah.
Because they collect a lot of money from a lot of different donors, right? They're doing a lot of outreach responses, and I'm also concerned about the brand, right?
Yep.
So you have one breach of that small little office, right?
Yep.
A lot of donors suddenly get concerned. What
Yep.
happened to my details? Did my money go to where I thought it would be, or is it in the hands of a bad guy, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
definitely important.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, and I think I'll add another point to this and for those, depending on what bracket you're in, some folks that do donate into charities, also knowing what you're donating into. Now, I'm going to bring an example because, and again, this conference does allow us to get comfortable with being a little uncomfortable. For example, the South Asian diaspora that I belong to, and being part of the Muslim, a minority diaspora in the Muslim community, every week, at Friday prayers, besides being told about how I'm Satan's little soul, the end is always, you're this bad, but don't forget to donate. Like, okay, maybe you can be saved. Sure. But that said, they make you tap your card. And so, in one of the mosques, you can go in, and there's this fancy little station over there, which is connected to the internet. And I had the priest saying, look, wow, you can now tap. E-donation. You have to also know where you're putting some of your donations into. And there's some serious questions to be asked about how some of these payments are processed, how they're received. And I will tell you categorically, in some of those boards, things fly around in email. Things fly around on WhatsApp saying, these are donations, this is the highest donor, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to look at these practices, even if you're on the other side. Now that said, I want to, because of your threat intelligence background, and I know, we're focusing on keeping the first things first, but this conversation is going that way. So let's enjoy the organic flow. There's this, in the world of insurance, we all know this, and for those of you that don't, one of the biggest seminal moments over the last 12 months in cyber insurance, when Lloyd's sneezes, all of us catch a cold. When Lloyd's decide that they're no longer going to cover acts of war or any nation-state attacks against an institution, it did send a lot of worry across the community. From a nation-state perspective, charities are also a massive, massive target. And Sick Kids was targeted, although Lockbit later on came and said, oh, that was a mistake. But can you provide a little bit of perspective on, from a nation-state perspective, why are they going to start hitting charities?
Yeah, because it goes back to, and maybe I didn't quite unfold it as as much as I could, but again, it could be for a variety of reasons, right? Depending on what that charity or not-for-profit has access to, be it in terms of donors or populations they're serving. Yeah. For example, if you consider, cases where maybe, for instance, let me use this example. Recently, if anybody has been following the news, there was a lot of hacktivist attacks on Canadian, especially public sector, because of the Ukrainian Prime Minister's visit to Canada and us showing support, etc. Well, cases like that also involve, at times, charities, people who volunteer their time, people who may be working in alignment with certain populations that may be targeted, right? So the information of those individuals, sometimes it is just those individuals who I may want to spy on for one reason or another. We hear about this all the time without naming particular nation states. But it could also be for other reasons, such as you have a connection into, maybe if you think about COVID and the pandemic, maybe this is a nonprofit that works with research institutions or other organizations that have access to some IP or confidential sensitive information that I'm after. So nation states, it could be for a variety of reasons. It could be political. Yeah. It could be because it allows them an in into other critical services and infrastructure that can impact the citizens, or otherwise, maybe individuals who have who are behind certain causes that I want to target individually, such as activists and otherwise. So I think it's just there are many reasons. goes back to making sure you have a full understanding of what you're doing and what you have access to and what the bad actors might be after.
Yeah, and I think, for everyone that's in this room, and again, you've chosen specifically to be here probably because of either being part of a board or just interested in the topic. One of the biggest things, for example, one of the boards that I'm on, and I can name them, is CDCD, Community Development something Durham. My bad. But we do deal with housing in the Durham region. And one of the things that myself and the CEO have been talking about is if our system so you have immigrants coming into and marginalized groups coming into the Durham region, we resettle, for example, folks from Ukraine, folks from Afghanistan, so on and so forth, and we use a system which matches them to a property where they can get affordable housing or matches them to a home, so on and so forth. The biggest thing that we're going through right now is if that system goes down, people still have to be placed. Mm-hmm. And from a manual perspective, how are we going to do it? And just going through those exercises really takes us quite far. And to your point, just to put it into a quantitative sense, when we reviewed 2022 and just looked at some basic logs and some basic queries, or did somebody try to, for example, brute force into the site? Now, why did the site have the administrative console open? That's a discussion for another day, and that's a discussion when the CEO realizes, and my apologies to any marketing folks in the room, but if you can develop on PHP or WordPress, doesn't make you a developer. FYI. You're great at doing drag and drop, you're great at doing design, which is good. But at the same time, if you don't understand how that code's working, there is a problem over there. You can't read those processes, there is a problem over there, which is why you need developers at the table to explain that to you. But one of the things that came out from doing that exercise was we looked at how many brute force attempts there were, and thank goodness for decent password management policies, but how many brute force attacks there were just on that URL. Mm-hmm. And that was very, very revealing. So with that said, I'm going to bring it to closing comments right now. And Brent, I want to start off with you, since you're coming at this from your own experience and then also your experience on the human board, since you've now hopped on as well in terms of providing leadership training, so on and so forth. For leaders that are out there, and if you had to sort of get them started, what would be one area of leadership training and security that you would say, start off over here to build your own awareness as a leader?
That's a good question. So many cybersecurity leaders come from the technical side of the space, right? Not the other side. And it's important that, as these leaders grow, they develop more of the soft skills, right? They develop more of the business skills, right? How to navigate the organization, how to understand the mandates, how to understand the strategy, how to understand the finances of how it all works. So spending the time there growing, and certainly, finding those leaders in the space that you know of that are willing to provide that mentoring, coaching, guidance, right? Understanding of similar situations they've been in the past and learning from them, right? And being able to take those learnings and turn them into your own day-to-day practices.
Yep. Graeme, question for you in terms of you've been involved with, and as a closing comment, you've been involved in curating the vCISO community quite a bit, and that initiative, it's challenging. You do need somebody at the helm. It's a full-time job, so it does go left and right a little bit. What do you think about the idea of potentially even curating a community of practice for not-for-profits around security? Is that something that you think would be a good first step from our side, sitting as advisors?
I think so. It's hard enough when organizations of varying sizes work in silos. We need to break down those silos internally, but there's no reason why there couldn't be a broader security discussion group, if you want to call it, for lack of better terms, to have the executive directors and so forth sit at a table and just understand, the questions to ask of their technology providers, of their partners, to say, how are you protecting our data? How is our data at risk? And even just to have those simple conversations on a broader level across organizations would go a long way, I think. Because it comes down to education. They're just not aware of what risks there are.
I agree.
And how they could be affected.
And I'll just add to that, just another point is when you're here and you get to visit some of the booths, to my teams, that's at the Youth Employment Services, Seneca College is here, University of Guelph, Rogers Cybersecurity Catalyst. Many of them actually have programs that they offer at no cost or at a very subsidized rate. And those programs can be a very, very good starting point. Maybe not necessarily for a leader per se, but for some of the frontline staff that you have, making that part of the professional development is a very good way to sort of start moving down this very important journey. And with that said, just as a closing, Maryam, from the Accenture perspective, you do run a lot of workshops, you run a lot of different services that are ad hoc for the community. What kind of services can they access from Accenture, and how can they learn more about what they can receive just as a starting point in their work?
Yeah, so I think in terms of some of what is available, there's a lot in terms of volunteering and impact that both from a cybersecurity perspective. If you reach out or look at our website, there will be resources in terms of multiple. We have something called Tech for Good. There's a number of other initiatives as well. And the focus is always to make community impact, be it in terms of technology resources or volunteering or expertise. Those are there because that's the other piece of it. I just wanted to quickly mention. As you bring in volunteers, you also, with the sensitivity of what some of the information is, you need to make sure that the people who are coming in to volunteer have the right expertise, but also trust it. So I think those are the elements that I will point out.
Absolutely. And with that, if I had to drop in my 2 rupees of thought for a closing, I'd say that one of the elements that I've learned from this discussion, and thank you all for participating, is this element of, if you want to start off in security, one of the things that you look for is being a good storyteller and going back to those experiences that you have. And I've said this many times before, and I'll say it again. There are very good security practitioners out there, but very few, in my optic, that can communicate well. And for me as a leader, one of the first things that you want to do in your not-for-profit is that awareness around security. And if I can point you in any direction, the province of Ontario last year, when they created these special avatars and these gamified forces, and you took on a character during the conference, that was a very interesting way to get conversations started. And for those of you that have the time, the government of New Zealand just released an interesting, humorous set of ads related to security, specifically around trafficking, specifically around youths that are misrepresenting their age and then landing up on certain sites, which I'm not going to name because I know my mom's watching online. Hi, Mom. I'm not on the Jerry Springer show, like I said. I'm still here at Women in Cyber. So I highly recommend taking a look at those assets because they're good starting points for all of you. With that said, I've always believed, and thanking you for your time, that when you start off in leadership, it's about investing in yourself. When you become leaders, it's about investing in the community. So thank you all for investing your time in the community. Thank you all for listening. Enjoy the rest of the conference. We'll be around if you want to chat. Thank you.